There was police actually standing outside the gates of the hotel, and I'm like, what the hell is going on? Basically, the industry that I just jumped into is illegal industry in China, right? So I was like, okay, what do I do here? We applied for all the accelerators. All the YC 500 startups of the world rejected us. Yeah. And there's this random accelerator in Hawaii called Blue Startups, started by the co-founder of Tetris, that accepted us. They agreed to back us for 25K US dollars at a time for key reply. And we were like, heck it, let's go. One question I asked him before is, hey, what if this company fails? What would you do? He said, I'll build another company doing the same thing. I think that obsession and the pursuit of excellence is what we really look for. And I think that passion that the founder has, with our experience, then we can amplify that even more. If I were to build a company in the AI space or like any space, like consumer products or whatsoever, there'll be two things that I would pay attention to. One is
a serial entrepreneur who has sold multiple tech companies, from launching his first startup after graduating from SMU to leading a company through a $400 million acquisition.
10 years of life lessons condensed into 60 minutes. This is You Make It Look Easy with Spencer Yang.
Morning, Spencer.
Morning, sir.
Glad to have you here with us today. All this while, we've come a long way. I think I've probably known you over the last 2 or 3 years, bro, from pitching you as a potential investor to an investor. I think over the last 2 or 3 years, that probably has already morphed in many other forms, and always appreciate you being able to take time for advice or hit you with ideas. I think today will be slightly of a different front. Want to know who actually is Spencer Yang, apart from everything that we can read online about it. So maybe you tell me, how would you describe Spencer?
Thank you, Elston, for having me here. I think I definitely echo what you mentioned. We've both came a long way since we first connected. I think at the time you were, trying to understand more and connecting with more people. Very, very fortunate to have connected with you back then. And then, of course, watch you and the team grow over the last couple of years. So very, very blessed. And thanks for having me here today. Yeah, happy to share a bit more about myself. I think for me these days, the way that I would describe myself, and I think that might be different from how other people describe me, is I'm passionate, I'm curious, and I'm a builder. So I think that's kind of the three things that I would describe about me. And I think one of the things I do chase these days is like the flow state of working on things to try to really enjoy what I'm doing with people that I enjoy working with, and of course talking to great individuals like yourself.
Where you mentioned a few words like builders, I wouldn't go deep into it, but as I was stalking you and really doing the research, a few trends keep coming up. I think from the start, even in your university times, you were already co-founding a company, and probably in the last 10, 15, 20 years, you've done it multiple times. I see this coming up a lot. Maybe you build something, it gets acquired very, very successfully, I think twice. Go back into a corporate world, and when you're in a corporate world, you're at like the top of the corporate ladder, and then going back to the startups, right? Like, why do you think this keeps coming back? Like, normally people would either want to cruise or see how can take it to the next level, but you always find yourself back down wanting to build something from ground up. Like, where does this come from?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, right? And I really am grateful that you kind of like went through and looked through my experience. I would say from the inside looking out, it definitely doesn't feel like much. But I guess when you put it this way, it definitely feels like there's some trends that have emerged, right? I think if I were to ask myself over the last couple of years, and I've did a bit of reflecting as well, I think it's one of the main factors, I think, is how I grew up. Right, in some ways. I think when I was growing up, of course, I was always drawn to a fascination around building things like, Lego and so on. I think we all played with Lego back in the day. I took it maybe a little bit too seriously at the time, was also reprimanded by my parents quite a little bit, when I was younger. And then also, I think both my grandparents were architects themselves. So they were, we migrated from China to Singapore when I was pretty young. So immigrant family in some ways. And then my grandparents, they were architects. So I think they had this, since young, I think they were like, hey, building things is cool. So I think I had that notion growing up in some particular ways, right? That's kind of how I felt maybe like early childhood. And then I think with regards to what you mentioned earlier about like excellence and so on, I think for me, that was very, very important. Perhaps I think one of the incidents that I've I still do recall, it's just, when you are growing up, when you're going through schooling, I think we all go through certain challenges, right? And for myself, I think there was periods in time where I was struggling in school, with a little bit more outcasted by my peers and whatsoever, right? For a variety of reasons, right? It could be me, it could be them, and all the sort of things. And I found that during those moments, it was really helpful to focus on a few things that I was good at doing, right? Whether it's playing basketball, or whether it's like, playing volleyball, or like, doing some exercises, or organizing some activities or whatsoever, right? Or like just hanging out with some friends, or playing some games like Dota and so on. And we can talk about Dota a little bit more later. But essentially, I think those things really helped me to anchor myself a lot more around different communities of people. And I think that helped me to find a lot more purpose in life as well. And then maybe fast forwarding a little bit to, what you mentioned, my first startup. I think at the time I was in college, I just was studying first year in Singapore Management University. So I chose to study in Singapore for a variety of reasons. And one of the courses that I remember taking for the first one is a mandatory course called Technology and World Change. And the professor is actually quite good, very, very smart, but does like to drone on a little bit. So I did fall asleep in class quite a few times.
It happens.
But I remember one of the assignments that he gave the class that was very, impactful for me, I think, was to write a blog post every single week and make sure that you submit it about technology in general and how it changed the world and so on. And when you are given this kind of task, you kind of have to take your assignment seriously, like, especially first year. Got a really chong heart in school. It's the SMU smuggler culture, right? Yeah, so I'd read TechCrunch, I read about advertising, TechCrunch, and I just saw these companies raising money and everything. I was just, oh my God, it's so cool, right? And it's 2010, right? This is like 2010 when like tech was just booming all around. So I had this like stupid idea to start a art e-commerce website, and that was kind of how I started my building journey in the technology space. Some naivety and some fun experiences, pressured by the school.
No, I mean, in that short 2-3 minute reply, I could already see so many of that reflective over the last 10, 20 years of your career. You talked about writing a blog. I guess that's also what led you to writing your Medium post, right? And I was looking through the Spencer Young media post. I could also see how the things you write had a direct influence into what you were doing. At the start, I think you were writing about stable coins. You were writing about wallets that led you with Kobo wallets. I saw you writing about crypto ads that probably ties in with your time at CoinMarketCap. So I think it was really intriguing because you said all this started from a kind of like a mandatory task that your teacher had asked you about. There was something they talked about your earlier influences, right? You mentioned when you were just growing up, point about being outcasted. How, if you can walk me through like what happened and how did that shape who you are today?
Yeah, for sure. So I recall quite, I would say now fondly in some ways of my experience. I think it's one of those things where growing up, you have very little perspective, right? You have school, you have your parents, and then you have what's immediate around you, right? And some maybe immediate interests. So at the time, I think the context over here was I was in middle school at the time. So it was like, I think different periods in time, right? But I think the one that maybe like shaped me the most these days is like in middle school, I went to a school called Dunman High School. It was basically a government school, very, very well regarded in the East, right? And then when I was in middle school, secondary 2, basically, there was this whole introduction of the integrated program. So I think we were the first batch actually to have this like true train program, right? Basically what it means in layman terms is you don't have to take O-levels and you can just go straight to the A-levels, right?
Basically, it's a cohort that feels that it's way too smart. We don't have to put you through it. You have all the right qualities. Let's just send you directly through it.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, Dunman High didn't have that, right? So Raffles Institution was one of the first schools along with Hwa Chong to do that. And they basically had a like open enrollment. They're like, hey, if you are in secondary school right now, secondary 2 right now, you can take a test with us and go through a round of interviews and whatsoever. And then, you might get accepted to the secondary 3 batch. So there is the opportunity. And then after going through rounds of tests and so on, there was maybe like 12 to 15 people that were selected to enter Raffles Institution in secondary 3. And I was one of them, right? So I would say I was quite lucky to sort of almost like striking the lottery, right? In some ways to get into the program and not having to study for O-levels. Great, right? Peak, it's almost like, buying something, right? Once you buy something, once you enter that, that's like a peak excitement, right? But then I think that peak excitement faded very quickly the moment I got into school because, like there was already cliques being formed, right? And me coming from a different school and so on, it was kind of yet again being sort of a bit on the outside, right? And I think in some ways, there's like a series of events that happened that made me I guess in my class, just not very, some people in my class doesn't really get along. And at the time, there wasn't much like perspective that I have. So I really struggled through that experience. In fact, like, being quite disappointed in myself and all that kind of things, right? But I think what really happened and also what really helped me to sort of come out of that was a few things. One was, of course, I found a clan in Dota that I was able to play quite regularly with and were quite competitive. So that helped me to like focus my energy on something, right? And also don't study for O level, right? So you can just
Have
like
a lot of time.
focus on gaming, right? And secondary 4 is great, right? That was one that helped me got out of it.
Yeah.
The second one was I think I started playing basketball with my neighborhood kids where I live, which is around the Katong area, right? And just hanging out with people who are just like not refugees, I think was really helpful for me to gain more perspective about what life is outside of school, right?
Yeah.
It's a little bit like going through army, but a little bit earlier, right? So that was my experience. And then through that, I had a lot more like external social networks and so on. And I realized that, hey, there's just like, people actually outside of the school appreciate me more in some ways. And I was like very, very grateful for that, right? To have that additional perspective. So I think those two things I think really helped me. So I think and aside from that, I think also just pushing for a little bit more excellence in what I was doing, especially in junior college, with sort of like playing very intensely and competing on the volleyball side of things, sports and other things. I think that really helped me to just gain that confidence back again. Yeah.
What I'm hearing is a lot about being able to identify and find your tribe. Be it in Dota. You mentioned about volleyball and basketball. I thought I was fairly tall. Like you are like close to 2 meters, I think.
Yeah, I'm fairly close. I'm 6'4",
Yes.
194. So yeah, it's
so
close.
no wonder like I would pick you in my basketball and volleyball team as well. Do you say that your family was hard and strict on you?
Yeah, definitely. I think like sometimes people do have this idea of the Asian parent, right? I think my parents were immigrant parents in Singapore. They were Chinese by upbringing, and then when they came to Singapore, I don't think they very adapted super well to the Singapore society in some ways. And I think Singapore, even though we are Chinese majority, but we do have a very, very unique culture, right, in Singapore. And of course, if I was growing up in Singapore, it's fairly straightforward because I came here at elementary 1 all the way through, right, the Singapore education system. So I would say, in terms of my experience, I was able to adapt very, very well to the, and of course, these days, Singapore is very, very diverse, right? There's so much international, expats, migrants, and so on. But I think at the time when I was growing up, it was still a little bit difficult and I think they also are not like the most sociable sort of creatures. And I think they mostly kept to themselves and their immediate work kind of, connections. So I think in that sense, I would say they were able to focus a lot more energy on me, right? Especially the earlier days, right? Before middle school and stuff. And I think in that sense, that definitely carried through, where they were strict on me. They were comparative to me with other kids as well, and some of these things, right? I think we all have our fair share of like childhood sort of like experiences, and whether the negatives and the positives. I think for me, that helped me to at least channel it these days into something a bit more positive. But there are also times when, we also will reflect upon, and in my case, I will also reflect and ask myself, would that have been better? Would I have been maybe a more positive, person earlier on in my life, without those experiences? Perhaps, right? But I think at the end of the day, we take what we get and we try to work with it. Yeah.
I guess the reason I'm asking is because, many people in their career maybe would have an illustrious career, but maybe sometimes it's at one company or two company. And as I was going through and listing down, your timeline, I would say from 2011, what I'm seeing is like the ability to repeatedly come out above, even though you're in a brand new environment, right? And I think that shows that someone has the skill sets to replicate success. It isn't just, right time, right place, like a one-off. And just to share more, right? Let's say I would start from even education phase. I've also found out that, in SMU, you were also in the scholarship program. So I think from an academic perspective, already kind of pulling across your peers. With your first startup with Outcasted, right? I realized that you guys were doing government deals, building one of the first chatbots for gov.sg. And I would say that's probably fresh out of school, or maybe partly of it is still in your end of your schooling years at SMU. Of course, with QReply, some of the chatbot companies, with being the first few employees at like CMC, getting acquired, doing your next few startups, now moving to a VC space. I think over the last 12 to 13 years, I can probably pattern match this cycle of it happening like 5 to 6 times already. So do you think this is external influences, like, your parents being strict on you, Or is it just you being very self-demanding of yourself?
That's a great question. And I appreciate you sharing the one point which is around like how there seems to be some level of repeatability here, right? And I think initially I think I would say that I didn't feel like it could be repeated. I think even to today I do attribute a lot of the successes to luck and just being sometimes right place, right time. And I can share a couple of examples later on how I feel luck actually does definitely play a point, right? But I think the point of me these days is that I do try to, I think looking back, I am quite driven initially by external influences of how I grew up. But I think I've internalized that to demand a certain level of excellence. I think both my partner, my wife, and myself, we all demand quite a bit of excellence in ourselves, in our relationship, and also in ourselves in terms of trying to push on certain things. I think that has helped me to essentially find that motivation and the fire. And I think fortunately as well, I've been able to surround myself and build a really strong, not very big, but small group of friends that are very motivated as well. And sometimes we just bounce off ideas with each other, try to encourage each other, and just be there for each other when we're down. Because at the end of the day, the success is almost like the score, right? But it's like what you put in, the grind and the work, and sometimes just not knowing what is going on. There's so many times in those journeys, right? And even now, where I have no idea, I woke up and I have no idea what I'm doing, right? And then you try to get through the day and then you try to like figure it out. And then you're like, you realize, actually, maybe I'm onto something here, right? Because I think there's always this, I think we all have this like pattern recognition, what we call gut feel, which essentially is like some level of like pattern recognition that we have built up over time, right? So I think at least now I've been able to pattern recognize a little bit on how that takes and being able to carry that through, as you mentioned, to some of the founders that we advise and we support and we invest in now, I think is really helpful. But that being said, I think maybe I'll just leave the one thing, which is I think I still believe a lot in luck and believe a lot in having the fire, and the passion is very important, because if I'm not passionate if I'm not passionate about it, if I'm not like really hungry and hustling, going for it, then I don't think any of these opportunities would happen anyway, right? Because it's so easy to just give up and forget it.
Yep. I mean, I think you credit to luck, but I also have to believe that people make their own luck. People see all these things that, is on here. People see the credentials of Zuckerberg or Bezos, but they don't see the things that they will miss, right? The failed experiments. When has it been lucky for you? You said that you have a certain story. Maybe you can, share about how that came about.
Yeah, so many times. But I can share, like maybe one or two examples of when I really felt lucky, right? I think the first one was probably in the first one I can remember recently, especially for the last 7 years, I've been very committed in the fintech and crypto industry, right? So, early on in the crypto and fintech industry, I was really fortunate. I went to China at the time just because that was before the ICO ban in China, right? Before September 4th. So I think I recall I was there on September 1st, I think. It was a Friday. So I went there expecting to go to this conference. And then when I went to the conference, there was police actually standing outside the gates of the hotel. And I'm like, what the hell is going on, right? And then it turns out that on Monday, the Monday after, China sent a notice, September 4th, that ICOs are illegal. And basically the industry that I just jumped into is illegal industry in China, right? So I was like, okay, what do I do here, right? So I actually I was considering just like, maybe heading back to Singapore or like heading somewhere else, just to kind of sort things out. But then I think one of the things that happened was my friend was like, hey, you're in Beijing, why don't we just grab a drink? And it was through that sort of meeting that I actually was introduced to the founder of F2Pool, Shen Yu, who wanted to, at the time, start a cryptocurrency wallet company called Kobo. And that was actually the reason why I ended up, and of course then I was proactive in helping the team out and so on. And then I ended up joining as one of the earlier employees. Yep. So that really exposed me, I think, to the intricacies of the industry. Okay. And of course, these days, Kobo has now, over the past 7 years, have built themselves to be one of the leading custody providers in the crypto space with Bitcoin and everything else, right? So very, very happy to be there in the early days, with the team and hustling the very small WeWork in Beijing, and then made the move to go to China, right? And it was also, and the second, I think one of the more lucky ones, incidents for me was the first day in which I started at the company. One of my other colleagues, who's also starting as the first day, he was like randomly, he was like, hey, you're leading up international, right? So I have this friend of mine who have this friend, who have this friend, who have this company that wants to do some international SEO for the company. And they seem pretty popular in the crypto space. I thought, okay, cool. Happy to chat with them, right? So I was introduced through 7 degrees of connection to the founder of CoinMarketCap. And he and my previous business partner jumped on the call and decided to start working together. And it was really because of that we started a relationship with the company and the founder. And then when he needed help, when he needed resources, we jumped on to help out. And then, I think it culminated, of course, in me and my previous business partner leading up the company as she was the CEO and I was the VP of Operations and Growth. And of course, we were, as you mentioned, there was some major industry events, and we were acquired by Binance and so on. So that was honestly through a series of very fortunate events that those kind of things happened.
You simplified in a 1-minute statement, but you went for a conference, it got banned, there were police. You went out for a serendipitous drink, you end up joining Kobo, and somehow through 7 connections, you knew about CoinMarketCap, you joined them, and then they get acquired. This feels too much of a coincidence, which also really makes me feel like people make their own luck, because you have to first say yes to, quote unquote, going to a crypto conference in China, which we know is often more touchy with value transfer.
Yeah.
But I think there's a little bit of characteristics which could be opportunistic, risk taker. But one interesting thing is I feel you've managed to always be ahead of the curve almost 2 or 3 years earlier. With AI chatbot, your first few startups, now every company says they're an AI company, right? Earlier, which you said, going to a conference where, police will be outside a conference of a new industry, but right now, there's more than 50 conferences on crypto around the world. How is that possible?
Yeah, that's a really good one. Like, how am I always a few years earlier than the mainstream?
And maybe there are other ones that didn't work out well also, right?
Yeah.
Like how is that possible? Is it some characteristics, or is it just you're always open to new ideas? That's why everything is possible and you're proven wrong. Like, help people understand how is that replicable?
Yeah. I think the way that I think about being, to put it in one word, being early, is that you have to be willing to be early and wrong enough, right? I think for me, there are many times, and of course, these are the more luckier instances in which I was early and I was right. But definitely, I think what I realized is that there's so many times I was early and I was wrong, right? I think I can't name too many at the top of my head right now, but definitely in art, art e-commerce is just definitely too early, right? I think people still want a physical art. So why was I doing that in 2010? That was stupid.
There's NFTs now though.
But now you have NFTs, right? So but maybe 12 years too early, right? And then I think chatbots as well in AI. Candidly, speaking at the time, 2015, 2016, what we were selling was mostly around the hype of the Messenger platform, the Facebook Messenger platform. People desire automation. But the algorithms at the time, the data sets, the hardware, the infrastructure was not ready, right? So a lot of times we have to basically human train and be able to train these bots and so on. And the results and the confidence that we have of these answers are very, very poor, right? Of course, these days when you when you talk to ChatGPT or Cloud 3.5 by Anthropic, the answers are so good, right? It helps you write code, it helps you write tests, it helps you write articles, or even interview questions in a podcast, right? Or anything, right? So it's really amazing how that has happened, right? Maybe it comes back to the 2010 class on TechCrunch, on technology, right? Where you had to read TechCrunch all the time. Sometimes reading all these things, I think you have a bit of FOMO. And for me, I think the FOMO is quite real. So I always like to be early because I think, in a very competitive field, when I recognize that I'm not going to be number one by mainstream standards, right? I don't think I'm like Albert Einstein IQ. I don't think I'm Lee Kuan Yew IQ, right? So I think that if I were to compete against anyone like yourself on a level playing field, I'll probably lose, right? But if I were to compete on some level of like being opportunistic or being a little bit earlier, perhaps I will be able to find a community and also be embedded enough so that by the time things are already picking up, and when the masses arrive, then I would be able to to maybe even hop onto the next thing, right? So being early, I think, is quite important in that aspect. I'd rather be early actually than to be in the mainstream in some ways.
I think that also entails to have a certain level of self-confidence. I can relate to that, right? Because even speaking to other founders or even in a personal journey, I would agree that there's a certain level of self-confidence being able to go into a brand new industry where maybe even regulation is a bit blurred. There are probably more, dead competitors than alive. Like, where do you think that came from?
I think I built up the confidence to be earlier, to be able to take some risks from a few factors. One of them is definitely, I think, even though my parents were not business people, unlike many of my peers or friends who were in business, and they were sort of trained to do business, right, since young. My parents were definitely average working class individuals who were yet still comfortable, right? So they have their savings, they have their own lives, and I think they are quite comfortable. I think that unburdens me a little bit. So I didn't have the burden of like having to overtly have to take care of them and so on, and also very healthy, very, very fortunately. So I think in that sense, I think that helps, right? And I think the lack of, basically some level of freedom of being able to be a bit more irresponsible definitely helps, right? That's the first one. I think sometimes I do have a lot of friends who talk to me about their situations where they might need to take care of others and so on. As a result, they are unable to take some risks, right? So I think that's one. The second area I feel is that it's some level of obsession. I think that really helps. But also because I, maybe through my upbringing, have gone through, instances where I was like, nothing, right? I was bullied, I was nothing, I was mediocre and so on. And I think because of that, I feel that, the cost of being mediocre is, I've been there, right? I can go back again. I can go back to zero again. I can go back to being scrappy again, right? So because of that, I think I do have this, what I call range maybe, right? In how I can extend. It's like I can, in Chinese there's a saying, 大丈夫能屈能伸, right? So I can extend, but I can also draw back, right? So I think in this particular case, I'm quite willing to draw back and go through the scrappy experiences, and it's not too bad. It's actually pretty fun, right? So maybe because of that, I'm like, hey, what's there to lose, right? Because I already had zero before.
Yeah. Do you think most of the time, this internal motivations comes from people with a little bit of like a chip on their shoulder?
Yeah, I think the chip on the shoulder definitely helps in some ways. Being an immigrant in a country like Singapore, I think definitely helps a little bit to build up too many chips. But I think it's also this like range where it becomes too much, right? That you can't take it anymore. You just feel like you want to withdraw into a hole and just hide yourself there. I think there is this tendency. But I do think that if you have other values that you are able to sort of like overcome with that, in my case, I think I am quite competitive, quite demanding on myself, and I do pursue those flow states and so on, right? So as a result, I think it definitely does help me to overcome these problems that comes with some of these chips. And also early on in my career after university, I was somehow, because of maybe thanks to TechCrunch, very obsessed about the US, right? So also going there with my co-founders with almost nothing, right? We joined an accelerator. We applied for all the accelerators. All the YC 500 startups of the world rejected us. Yep. And there's this random accelerator in Hawaii called Blue Startups, started by the co-founder of Tetris, that accepted us. They agreed to back us for $25K US dollars at a time for key reply. And we were like, heck it, let's go. Right. So the next week we were on a flight to Hawaii to attend the accelerator, and we spent 3 months there building. We didn't do any surfing, unfortunately. Like we were basically in and out of the office at 8 a.m. to like 1 a.m. And even the Lyft driver at the time was like, "You guys are the only ones working so late. Oh my god!" But yeah, these are the experiences I think that I've looking back really enjoyed.
Interesting. Yeah, I think a lot of different interviews that I spoke with normally have some kind of quote unquote chip on their shoulder, maybe even like a childhood trauma that really drives them to want to go above and beyond. Because for yourself, like looking back at your time there were so many opportunities for you to just stay there and, quote unquote, what they like to say, climb the corporate ladder, or like you could still be at base right now, you could still be at CMC, you could still be at Kobo, but you must really like pain to want to always leave that and go straight into a startup. What are you looking for? Is it a certain sense of fulfillment? Is it, money? Because, upside from starting a startup is more. Is it passion? Is it the like for new tech? If you look back over the last 10, 12 years, every time that you've achieved this, you were willing to start from scratch and build it all up again. What do you think were your own personal motivations?
I think the motivations of going for repeated success or repeated achievements, for me, I think it really comes from a place of wanting to make sure that I was leading in a field. And the reality of leading in some field is that for us, more business background folks, there's none engineering or none research. Leading in a field, sometimes you have to be able to adapt to market trends, right? And markets really change, right? Especially if, let's say, for example, when you leave a big company, let's say when you were at Grab or when I was at Coinbase, in some ways the companies that we were working for with the brand it is the leading players in that field, in that space, in that industry, in those countries, right? And of course, sometimes when we were in those roles, when we talk to folks outside or when we try to strike business partnerships, it's a brand that carries through to make us close that deal, right? And the moment you leave those organizations, you basically have, right? You might be former XYZ company, right? You might be former something, but the reality of it is that you don't really carry through a lot of those brands anymore, right? And many of those things are not so important because people, I think, are quite practical, right? When it comes to these kind of things. So having been through a few of these experiences, I realized that the satisfaction of creating another version of you, it's almost like playing a new game, right? And finding a new meta is really satisfying. And I think I really do enjoy that these days. So I'm quite willing now to let go of it and then try to find something new. For example, these days, my partners and I, we spend a lot of time in the Bitcoin ecosystem, right? Building Bitcoin DeFi, building in the Bitcoin scaling space, Bitcoin restaking and so on with the companies that we advise and support, and deep dive and problem solve into all these things, right? Whether it's hiring, whether it's building. And I find that just discovering a new meta is so interesting, right? It's almost like, when we were kids, we picked up a game and then we spend like hours and hours pouring into it, right? It feels like that to me. And I think maybe these days no longer that satisfied with just being top of one game. I do want to feel like I can play multiple games and be able to succeed at scale. I think that's the easiest way for me to explain that drive, I guess.
One thing I found out is that we're actually very much more influenced by our childhood than we think.
Yeah.
You mentioned about how in the early days, maybe looking at your grandparents being architects, creating a rough plan from a blank piece of paper, maybe sometimes doing some, I don't know if they had 3D modeling back then, maybe it's like physical modeling. You talked about going into a Dota game to kind of quote unquote escape a little bit from school, and every new game represents a new chance to prove yourself. I kind of see it in the same perspective where you probably now see startups as like a different Dota game, just that maybe instead of a 1 hour game, now it's a 3-year game. How much do you think it's influenced by your childhood characteristics, your childhood influences, your quote unquote trauma? Or do you think at some point in time that has helped you to like it and you've kind of gone closer to who you realize that maybe it's your calling, it's your passion? What do you think? Do you think that childhood influences really have such a huge impact on people?
Yeah, I definitely do think that childhood influences have a huge impact on people. Especially, I think the weird, unfortunate, and unconventional things that people do. I think in terms of, if I was just talking about a regular thing, right, it's probably influenced by the flow of society, right? Because the natural flow of society has this river that flows through, right? Like you get good grades, you go to school, and so on, or as we are taught by the system, right? But going against the system, going against the grain, it's almost like swimming against the river, or like getting out of the river and finding a new river, or finding a new plane, right? Finding a new thing. That definitely has a little bit of more of like background in there. I think for me, definitely the quote unquote, as you mentioned, trauma, my upbringing, and also figuring out early on I would never be an architect because I can't really draw a straight line. That really helps, right? As you mentioned, like these days we have 3D models, but back then you just had to draw with your bare hands, right? And I think I did a test I think my uncle gave me a test to draw a line on a piece of paper, and I failed that terribly. So after that, I know, there's just some games that's not for you to play, right? And also the games I really suck at, like I can't play like first person shooters, right? I can literally point a mouse at your head and on a game and miss, right? Like that's like how bad I was at first person shooters. So I think in some ways you also recognize, for me, at least I recognize that there's some games that I just don't think I can win, and I wouldn't enjoy playing it because maybe the story is boring, right? Or I can't win, or it's just poorly designed, or it's just too long, or whatsoever, right? So there are definitely some games that I'm not interested in, and I think applying that to life is definitely helpful. One word that you mentioned that I want to also elaborate on how I view that word is passion, right? I think passion for something, a lot of people these days talk about the ikigai concept of like how you want to do something you're good at, do something that pays well,
The
and then
Venn
do something.
diagram
The Venn diagram, right? There's a period of time in my life, I think, especially maybe after losing a few titles or losing a few, when I leave certain companies or whatsoever, that I ask myself, oh, what is my passion, right? What is it that I'm most interested in? I think what I realized through my experience, at least, is that passion is something that is quite acquired. Like when you work on something, let's say if I prototype something, I build like what you have done, you build a podcast, right? Or you build a new startup. Through that experience, as you talk to more people, as you gain more traction, as you validate these ideas more, as you improve on it, that's when you realize that you actually are good at it, and you attain more level of mastery, right? And then as I attain more mastery in those things, then I feel like I was more passionate about it. So candidly, like about 6 months, 7 months ago, when I was starting to look at the Bitcoin ecosystem a lot more over the last 1 year, initially I was also super unsure what is going on. Like, is this going to be a thing, right? Would people actually want to use their Bitcoins beyond just buying on ETFs or holding it? It turns out that people actually do want to, right? There's so many interesting communities these days that have emerged around utility of Bitcoin, scaling it, using it for other things, that I just find that it becomes one of the most fascinating things. And I'm super happy to be a part of that industry and space right now.
I think often people use the word passion. I have a slightly similar definition of passion from you. I think that passion stems from interest, but is fueled by success. You can be immensely passionate about something, but I think it will wane off once you don't see enough success or traction. If anything more, it just becomes like a hobby, right? So I think, passion can be acquired. It can also be cultivated. And I think over the last 12 years, in my back of my mind, I always knew that you were going to move into a VC space. I think even as a personal builder, you were always active in the angel investing route. Now I think you've kind of like taken more of a more full-time approach towards VC investing. In fact, there was a quote that you mentioned in one of other podcasts. You said that angel investing is probably one of the most expensive hobbies, one of the lowest ROI, but it's still a very, fulfilling activity for you to do. So like, walk us through a little bit about, how has this transition from angel investing to a more full-time capacity been? And because you have went through the founder route multiple times, are there certain traits and caliber that you look for that you can maybe help pattern match to say, okay, I believe that this is a startup that can achieve certain success?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. So I think these days, candidly speaking, these days I still don't consider myself a VC. Right? I consider myself more of maybe a venture builder, to say, because I think in terms of deployment of capital, I think the VC role definitely does play a lot of like deal selection, a lot of like fund management, a lot of LP conversations. And those are things that I maybe don't enjoy as much yet, right? At this point, I think what I do enjoy the most is actually working together with the founders to grow the companies very, very actively, right? And the level of engagement is actually a lot higher than that of an angel investor, right? Because the angel investor, at least when I was angel investing, many times you can be even after you invest, of course, there are times when you can make strategic introductions, you can be helpful for certain things, you can offer some advice, but for the most part, it's not really something that you do full time, right? And you usually have another role. Maybe you're working at a different company, or you're working for a fund, or you're working on something else, right? Or just being happy, and that's totally okay, right? So there are many angel investors who do that. But I think what I am doing these days when it comes to these founders that we work with is that we get so involved that we almost run it like our own company, right? But as a result, we're not able to scale to the level of like, maybe a 1,000 portfolio companies, right? What we can only do is maybe like a limited amount, somewhere between 5 to 10 at any point in time. And I think that's where we devote our attention to. It also definitely helps that we have partners who have all done this before. So all of my partners for Block Space Force, we've successfully built and also invested, and also have our fair share of failures, of course, right? Exchanges, mining companies, Bitcoin exchanges, Bitcoin ATMs back in the day, regulated, non-regulated, and so on, and also like data companies and DeFi and so on. So because the space, the crypto and fintech industry is so big right now that there's so many of these things that would be very, very interesting, right? But at the same time, there's so many things that are important infrastructure pieces and need to be built. And I think the landscape is the technology, the plates of the world of crypto is also changing all the time, right? So you have to kind of adapt to those situations as well. So there's many things being changed, but the founder motivation and the founder's excellence is still the same. So what we look for when we work with these teams is, number one, we look for founders that have demonstrated some level of excellence and are still very, very insistent on being excellent or leading in their field. A little bit more like a soccer player that wants to just be one of the best strikers out there, right? That's kind of what we look for in ability, right? So for example, one of the companies that we work very closely with, Alchemia, they are a protocol that allows users to be able to trade Bitcoin transaction fees. The founder, Liu Zhang, was excellent not just in school, but also later on. But I think what really stood out, and was really what made us, like really build the company with him is the fact that he spent the last, 5-6 years researching and, building the Bitcoin transaction fee and block space. And I think the one question I asked him before is, hey, what if this company fails? What would you do? He said, I'll build another company doing the same thing. I think that obsession and the pursuit of excellence is what we really look for. And I think that passion that a founder has, with our experience, then we can amplify that even more, right? So I think that's what we look for specifically when we work with founding teams these days.
Earlier, we talked about you kind of being ahead of the curve a few times with AI chatbot, with more general blockchain, and now specifically in BTC development. Which stage of adoption do you think we are at right now for crypto? I think naturally, I knew that we wouldn't be able to veer away from crypto since we both are in the space, and that's something that's dear to us. But we have seen, let's say, with a BTC and ETH ETF on the horizons, it's come into effect. Like you said, you're going to a Bitcoin conference where a couple of the presidential nominees are going to be there. So this is something that's top of mind for them. But if you go on the general street, not everybody knows about crypto. Some of them still treat it with a 10-foot pole. Should we perceive that, hey, it will just always be a financial instrument? Just like most people will never be into angel investing, most people will never be able to trade options, and it's just a niche thing? Or like, how should we understand to what extent would the adoption of crypto be?
I think the adoption of crypto these days is something that will impact both of our and also the broader community's work, right? Because if we are working on something that has only 10 people, for example, looking at it, then the amount of things you can do is just fairly little, right? Fortunately, at this point, I think crypto globally has probably anywhere between 200 to 500 million, maybe 500 million like users. Whether they care about it or they hold it or they have some level of utility with it, right? I think Binance, if I'm not wrong, just turned 7 recently, and I think they announced that they have about over 200 million users. And I think Coinbase previously also published, like very high figures as well, hundreds of millions as well of users, over the last couple of years, right? So I think it's really cool that crypto, whether it's truly holding it in brokerages or whatsoever, has now become one of the most important alternative assets, right? And I think for us to continue to have more developments that's exciting for ourselves, that adoption needs to happen over time, right? But these days, I would say for myself, I'm actually totally okay with crypto being an alternative asset that is not something that everyone in the world holds, right? Like the dollar or like maybe a cup of coffee or water, right?
Gold bar.
Yeah, it doesn't have to
everyone's
be.
cup of tea, right?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be water, right? It can actually be an alternative. It can be an escape hatch. It can be something else. It can be a venue for art. It can be a venue for game currencies. It can be a venue for some really interesting financial innovation that we are not able to do using legacy infrastructure. So a lot of these things, I think, makes me a lot more, number one, humble about what we are working on, and also more realistic. But at the same time, I think the most important word here that I would use is hopeful. Like, I'm hopeful that more and more people will be a part of this community, no matter how big it is, and we can make something out of this, right? I think that's kind of what I'm okay with, and I do hope that we do have more exciting things happening in this part of the community and the world.
You mentioned about legacy system. I think one of Gary Gensler's most popular MIT course, he mentioned about the role of blockchain, because right now in the financial Web 2 world, he estimates that roughly 3% of the total financial world probably goes towards just like transaction fees, right? With something like crypto, which can maybe perhaps remove the middleman. We have seen things like DeFi. We have seen things like an AMM, which essentially remove third party. And, 3% sounds low, but 3% out of a couple $1 trillion industry, it's significant. Are you most bullish about the role of crypto in the perspective of a mode of transfer to replace legacy system? Do you see it more as a, like you mentioned, alternative asset? Like, what aspect of crypto do you see, coming up more and kind of becoming the dominant use case? Or maybe it's just an alternative asset, right?
Yeah, I'm definitely totally okay with crypto being an alternative asset that some people in the community actually use and prefer, right? I think these days we see that there are actually many people in various communities around the world, in developing markets and so on, preferring USDT on Tron. It's probably not the most sexy thing to be talking about, but it's definitely working for some of these people, right? And if it's working, then we should, in a way, understand why it's happening and be appreciative, and also create some systems around it, right? So I do think that there are some good trends in that regard. And to your point about the middleman fees, right? There's a reason why these middleman fees exist, right? In anything, right? Whether it's a distribution channel or a publisher for games and so on. The reason is because I think there is this information asymmetry or distribution asymmetry between different parties, right? And the resources required to bring something, like let's say if I invent a piece of napkin that is very, very good to use, the cost of distributing it to retailers around actually has cost, right? And even if I were to do a direct-to-consumer model, there's still shipping costs required, or advertising costs on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and TikTok that I have to incur, right? So because of that distribution and the distance between people, these fees are important, right? And I think when it comes to the financial system, the legacy financial system of the world, there's some usefulness that they do play in the middle, right? For example, if you accidentally made a wrong transfer of a wire transfer from one person to another, you can probably call up the bank and ask for them to maybe cancel the wire or to get your funds back in some way, right? Or if someone swipes your credit card and actually uses and then just like fraudulently use your credit card, you might be able to cancel the transaction, do a chargeback or whatsoever, and then cancel the credit card, right? So that it's no longer available. With self-custody, imagine if everyone in the world uses self-custody today. That is still not possible. It's going to be really hard to get recourse, right? What if you lose your private keys? What if someone uses your ledger, accesses it, and is able to spend the BTC or ETH in it, right? So there's still actually some cost over there, which is why I think these days there's a part of the crypto economy that requires the needs of custodians, MPC solutions, exchanges, centralized exchanges, all that kind of good stuff, right? So I think even within the crypto space, there's still going to be middlemen that actually will facilitate the transfer. So in some ways, I'm not as obsessed with crypto replacing all of the middlemen. But what maybe I do care about is that let's make the middlemen actually perform a real function in the process and not just extracting value because they can through existing power structures.
I think that's a age-old debate that crypto maxis would always have. Hey, if we have a middleman, does it not replicate what Web 2 already has? So I know there's a huge debate there. Maybe more of a founder VC question. We know that the VC world and startups run on narratives, and it really starts because let's say VCs. Every fund has an intended purpose. This is a crypto fund. This is an AI fund, right? So I've also seen a lot of, let's say, crypto blockchain companies right now all putting on the AI spin, right? And the very anecdotal evidence is when I go to an event in 2022, everybody gives themselves like a blockchain name. 2023 is the same name but .ai. And I think this kind of talks a bit about our broader thing about being the right timing to market, having conviction in a certain space, right? You mentioned the founder said that even if this startup fails, he'll still do the same exact thing again. What is your read on, this space where you start seeing some companies in blockchain try and play on the AI front, which is also a bit hard to say no to because everyone around you all is doing the same thing, right? So what's your advice to kind of like more so founders, not only in crypto, but navigating the space of, okay, should I want to be behind the trend in AI? Should I want to adopt it? Do I want to be edged to it so that it helps with valuation, with being seen as some innovative? Like, what's your general advice to founders navigating this?
Yeah, I think I'll kind of classify my solution or like suggestion. If I were to build a company in the crypto space again myself, or in the AI space, or like any space, like consumer products or whatsoever, there'll be two things that I would pay attention to. One is, how am I actually using AI tools for my users and for my internal team members and to my partners, right? Because at the end of the day, the goal of the company is not just to maximize profits or to make more revenues or to get more users, right? The goal is to create some level of value to your users and to yourself and to customers, right? And with the existing toolkits right now, it's almost like back in the day when people were adopting cloud technology, right? It really made DevOps and management so much easier, right? And I think you've worked with people who have that experience, at like some of these large organizations like Google Cloud, AWS, and so on. I think those technologies were fundamentally changing the way that we build companies, right? And I think AI has changed that relationship between us and the user, the products and the users, and us and our team, and also us in how we work, right? If I'm really bad at grammar, I'm now able to use that tool to make edits to my emails before I send them out, or to edit my press release, to add more maybe exciting languages or whatsoever, or help me think of multiple titles of my blog post. So these tools have now changed, and as technologists, we have no excuse not to actually leverage on them for making our customers and also ourselves more delighted in how we work. So that is, I think, one general thing that I would definitely employ. I would get like GitHub Copilot subscriptions. I would get ChatGPT or Cloud 3.5 subscriptions for my team. And I'll make sure that there's some level of thoughtful thinking about how we are actually using this to make our products more successful, right? And use that as a weapon in the toolkit to make that happen, right? And then to the fundraising side of things, I would say they sometimes can be one and the same, and sometimes they're not, right? There's sometimes when, in terms of fundraising or even just crafting a narrative for branding, that you kind of want to be hopeful for the future or craft a message of what you want the future to be. It's almost like you're writing science fiction and you're painting, like doing world building, right? You need to also create a world. And I think successful founders have this ability to create this reality distortion feel around themselves or the company that they're building, the space that they're in, right? And they are able to almost like sell that vision to people that, hey, this is what I think the future is going to be, and I'm going to will it into existence, right? So because of that, there's definitely an argument to say that, hey, if I'm now painting a vision of the future, the vision needs to have AI in it, right? I think that is undeniable at this point. The question, though, is if it's so undeniable, isn't everyone in the room or your competitors going to do the exact same thing? Yep. So how do you then differentiate from your people, right? You have to find that extra thing now, right? Like, for example, about 2 years ago when ChatGPT was first like brought to life and people were like, hey, this is really cool. There were a lot of companies that initially jumped on the bandwagon, which is general, hey, we're doing AI for travel or AI for whatever, right? And that worked, right? People were able to back on that.
Many times they could just be using an OpenAI API with their own wrapper.
Totally, right? Yeah. But you realize that now if you tell the same story, people will just be like, hey, what's next, right?
Yeah.
What else is there, right? Yeah. So I think the bar in which people have around these things also gradually increases. So any field, it's almost like running 100. I have this example, which is I think there was in a 100-meter race, right? There was a 10-second barrier back in the day, right? And in the moment one of these athletes actually broke that 10-second barrier, every other athlete was able to break that going forward. So sometimes I feel like in life and in many of these things, there's this arbitrary barrier that we set for ourselves, whether it's a new topic or a new existence or even crypto as an alternative asset, right? At the moment the barrier breaks, it becomes almost like weirdly undeniable, and everyone else just rushes into it, right? So I think then my sense is that the notion over here is that you really have to find the next thing then. What is the next barrier that you need to be able to break, right? And break that, right? So I think in the VC, when we're talking to investors these days, I think building AI for something is not going to work anymore. You have to be a lot more thoughtful about what does a customer really need, what is a unique advantage that you have, what is a unique market insight, and so on, right? And the team advantage that can help to carry through.
Yeah, I think at a recent OpenAI demo, when they showed about what they did with like tutors, we were just counting the number of startups that would get eaten up by then. Bringing the conversation back to Spencer Young. Now you're at your next stage of career, moving into investing, VC. I think you're definitely taking a lot more of a role where you can share your knowledge. Going to New York NFT to be a personality to talk about a certain topic, going on certain podcasts, media personalities. I can see you also more active on blogs. I think even with your whole new VC role, wanting to share that knowledge with up and coming founders. What's next for Spencer?
Honestly, I don't know what's next for me. But if I were to make a guess, I definitely want to continue building and helping to co-create companies that are successful. So that's one of the things that I'm very, very obsessed about. The second thing I think that I'm obsessed about these days is more like just personal health and my family's health and life in general. Definitely want to build a better life for ourselves so that we will be more happy, more relaxed, and maybe have the environment to do our best work. I do think that work and life is very integrated. It is life. So we just want to make our lives a little bit better, right? in the moment. There's like two certainties in life, right? There's like you get birth and you die, right? And in between, it's what you make of it, right? And I think the way I think about it is that I definitely want to make the in between interesting, exciting, meaningful, and hopefully impactful as well, right? So yeah, that's probably what I would classify as what I think would happen. But the future is very uncertain, right? Yep. And there's so many details that will change as you receive more information. Yep. And there's this saying that I have that I do hold on to is when you start a company or when you start a new project, the time in which you have the least information is actually when you first started. So many people write these like 2-year, 5-year business plans that is so grand, but you have to realize that when you write those plans, you have the least information about what works.
Especially you don't know what you don't know.
Exactly, right? So you don't know what you don't know. So the only thing that you can do is adapt, get more information, adapt, try new things, right? So really applying a bit of a design thinking way of thinking about things, build, prototype, and then like test and so on. That's kind of how I view it, right? So we're still in the testing mode of like what venture building or investing would look like for us for Block Space Force. And I do hope that with more data points, with more prototypes that we have done, with more of these, failures and successes, we'll be able to get to a better place.
One of the biggest learning I had on this episode of You Make It Look Easy is that you iterate fast, which is, the core criteria of a startup, but you pick your battles. Like with what you said, if you think that the cohort at school isn't best, let me find a cohort on Dota. Let me find a cohort in volleyball. Let me find a cohort in basketball. I know that I'm appreciated. I know I do well. And that also comes with being able to try many new things, quickly recognizing this is not what's for me. Let me move on. Right? I think that's a really, really good key takeaway that anybody can, replicate in their own lives, right? They don't have to feel that all these successes that I'm seeing through Spencer is unattainable. It all boils down to these routines, these aspects of self-confidence. One last question to wrap up. I want to go back to one of these key moments you talked about back in school where, you felt outcasted and you had a bit of an identity crisis knowing where your tribe is. What would you tell the Spencer Young back, the 15, 16-year-old Spencer Young, now that you've been through all this? If you could, go through time and speak to him, what would you have said?
Yeah. I definitely feel like this is a very important question. It's one of those questions where if I were to tell the person I was back then, how many years ago was that? Probably about, over 15 years, as you mentioned. I'll probably tell him to keep exploring, get new perspectives, and reframe the way you think about the world. Don't be stuck in that one way of thinking about things.
Appreciate it. Thanks a lot for your time, Spencer.
Thank you, Austin. Thank you, everyone.